Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Archer. I'm the Vice President of the Philadelphia chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. And I would like to welcome all ICAA members, Carpenter Company members, and guests to the 11th Annual Holm Lecture. As a side note, if you're not a member, please do join the ICAA. Just go to classicist-phila.org, click on membership. We'd love to have you join. Many wonderful programs and events planned throughout 2021, both virtual and, fingers crossed, coming back in person soon. Before we get started, I would like to give a special thank you to our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Tradewood Windows and Doors, Pine Moor Builders, Peter Zimmerman Architects, North American Window and Door, Capiletti Builders. To our silver sponsors, Spire Builders, Rittenhouse Builders, LePage Millwork, John Milner Architects, Ernst Brothers Builders, Duration Moldings and Millwork, and Archer and Buchanan Architecture. I'd like to also thank all our bronze, our patron, and our leader sponsors. You all make this program able to continue with our ICAA mission. Thank you. Tonight's program, co-presented with the Carpenters Company of the City and County of Philadelphia, is called The Golden City and the Legacy of Henry Hope Reed. The book, The Golden City, written by Henry Hope Reed in 1959, was just recently reprinted. I think it was its third reprinting, and has wonderful essays by both Alvin, Holm, and Catesby, Leigh. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Francis Morrone. Francis is an architectural historian and a writer, and the author of 13 books, including with Henry Hope Reed, the New York Public Library, the architecture and decoration of the Stephen A. Schwarzman Building. Francis is a recipient of the Arthur Ross Award of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, of the Landmarks Lion Award of the Historic Districts Council of New York, and of New York University's Excellence in Teaching Award. Mr. Morrone was also a longtime art and architecture critic for the New York Sun, for which he wrote a profile of Henry Hope Reed. And now I'd like to introduce Francis Morrone. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much. And good evening, everybody. It's always a great pleasure for me to speak about Henry Hope Reed. Henry was my friend and mentor, but beyond that, I think that Henry is an exceptionally important figure in ways that go beyond simply his advocacy of a contemporary classical architecture, important though that is. I think that Henry has influenced us all in ways that we're perhaps not fully aware. I think that Henry Hope Reed really influenced the way that we think about, the way that we as Americans think about historic architecture and the historic cities of this country. I think, indeed, Henry's influence on the way that we experience urban life in America is equal to that of someone like Jane Jacobs. And what I would like to do tonight is, first of all, to introduce you to Henry Hope Reed. Some of you may not need an introduction to Henry Hope Reed, but for those of you who may, you will get an introduction to Henry Hope Reed. I want to talk about Henry's life and works and the ways in which I think that Henry is such an important figure. And let me move on. This is Henry. He was born in 1915, died in 2013. He had a good, long life. He really pretty much spans the 20th century. I want also tonight to say just a little bit about Henry's connection to Philadelphia, because Henry's family comes from Philadelphia. Not originally. They actually came to this country in 1671 from County Antrim in Northern Ireland. But there were many distinguished Philadelphia Reeds. For example, there was Joseph Reed, who served at one time as secretary to General Washington and who was also a delegate to the member of the Continental Congress. So, we're talking about a very distinguished Philadelphia family. Joseph Reed's grandson bore the name Henry Hope Reed. Indeed, there were several distinguished Henry Hope Reeds in Philadelphia history. This Henry Hope Reed was a professor of rhetoric and belles lettres at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was indeed arguably the most distinguished member of the faculty of that great university in his time. Not least among his accomplishments, he introduced Wordsworth to America and was the great American Wordsworth expert. Henry Hope Reed died very young, alas, in a famous sinking of an ocean liner en route from New York to Liverpool, the SS Arctic, in 1854. And this is sort of a way of introducing the Reed family's involvement in that great old money profession of marine insurance back in the days when New York, Philadelphia, Boston were mercantile cities whose wealth derived from shipping. The great fortunes, of course, were made in shipping, but marine insurance was an extremely important business, and the Reeds were involved in that business. Henry Hope Reed, the professor's brother, a distinguished Philadelphia lawyer, William Bradford Reed, was the first Reed to move from Philadelphia to New York. And so it is that the Reeds have long lineages in both cities, Philadelphia and New York. This is another distinguished Philadelphia lawyer named Henry Hope Reed, Judge Henry Hope Reed, and we may even think of our Henry Hope Reed as Judge Henry Hope Reed. He certainly had the bearing of a judge. This is our Henry Hope Reed, born in New York City in 1915. So he wasn't born in Philadelphia, but he always, throughout his life, maintained a very, very affectionate relationship to Philadelphia. Went to Philadelphia whenever he was able, and was often said that his favorite architects were Philadelphia architects, particularly Horace Trumbauer, whom Henry adored. But he also often had very kind things to say about Thomas U. Walter. Of course, Henry wrote the definitive book about the architecture of the United States Capitol. And Walter was, of course, the architect of the Capitol Dome. Here we see Henry in Rome. Henry had the kind of educational background that you'd expect from someone of his place in the world. He attended St. Paul's School, and then he attended Harvard. Henry told me that at Harvard he was an undistinguished student. And quite possibly he was. But he nonetheless was obviously very interested in many different things. He majored in history. After school, he again told me that he spent a little while as a drifter. He worked as a journalist. He spent some time in Omaha, Nebraska, which is not the sort of place you'd expect to run into Henry O'Brien, but there you have it. And then he became interested in architecture. He didn't become interested in architecture at Harvard. At the time he was at Harvard, Harvard had gone completely modern. He was at Harvard when Walter Gropius came to Harvard. Rather, Henry told me that the man who really got him focused on architecture was somebody named Wayne Andrews. Some of you who are, as I am, of a certain age, will remember Wayne Andrews. He was an American architectural historian. He wrote many books, including what was once a very well-known book called Architecture, Ambition, and Americans, a book that is still very well worth reading, although it's been out of print for some time. Wayne Andrews, when Henry knew him, was the librarian at the New York Historical Society, an institution with which Henry would have a long and very fruitful relationship. Wayne Andrews would later go on to be a professor of architectural history at Wayne State University in Detroit. But Wayne Andrews, Henry told me, was the person who first got Henry really seriously looking at buildings. And so we may, think some kind thoughts about Wayne Andrews. And it was after that that Henry, who had from the beginning a very strong interest in architectural ornament, decided to study in Paris at the École du Louvre. This was the best place to go to study the French decorative arts. And so Henry's scholarly background wasn't in architectural history per se, but rather in the history of decorative arts, and particularly in the history of French decorative arts, and particularly of the 17th and 18th centuries. At the École du Louvre, Henry studied under the École's director, the legendary French scholar of decorative arts, Pierre Verlet. If this is your field, then that name resonates more strongly than perhaps any single other name in the field. Verlet was a very important figure, and he was a very strong influence on Henry. This is one of Pierre Verlet's books. This is a spread from one of Verlet's books where you can see the sort of thing that Verlet and others taught Henry about at the École in Paris. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that another of the protégés of Pierre Verlet was the great New York collector, Jane Reitzman. And if you want to get the measure of the sort of thing that Henry studied in Paris, you can visit the Reitzman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which are the galleries of French decorative arts of the Ancien Regime. And it's almost too rich. It's just an amazing collection of French furniture and interior decoration. But as I say, again, this was Henry's, if you will, academic background. Back in New York, Henry's interests gravitated to the American classical tradition. We're going to be saying more about this, of course, but I do wish to say that when we start sort of listing the things that Henry did that are so important to all of us, and that too many of us forget Henry was responsible for, we may begin with the fact that Henry, back in New York, was frustrated by the fact that so little was known about the classical tradition in the American arts. The stuff was all around us, but at the same time, scholars were thwarted by the fact that the stuff that was all around us was so poorly documented. This surprises a lot of people in 2021, where we're used to going to libraries and archives and being able to, pore over the drawings and the office files of famous American architects. But once upon a time, and not so very long ago, in the lifetime of many of us who are here now, this wasn't the case. So, for example, America's greatest architectural firm, McKim, Mead and White, their records weren't on deposit in any archive until Henry took it into his own hands to track down these materials and make sure that they were available to us all in the library of the New York Historical Society. So you can go there today and you can study the office records of McKim, Mead and White, and they are there because of Henry. Similarly, Henry did that with the papers and files and drawings of Cass Gilbert. He did it as well with George B. Post. All these architects who are today considered titanic figures in the history of American architecture are studyable for scholars because of Henry Hope Reed. If this was all Henry had done in his lifetime, he would deserve to have somebody give a lecture about him. But of course, it wasn't all that Henry did. Henry did so much more. He briefly taught at Yale. He made the acquaintance of a very interesting man named Christopher Tunnard. And with Christopher Tunnard, co-wrote a book called The City of Man. Now, when you look at the cover of this book, it says The City of Man by Christopher Tunnard. It does not say, as I say in my caption to this slide, by Christopher Tunnard and Henry Hope Reed. But if you're that very alert sort of reader who reads acknowledgments and introductions to books, you'll note in reading The City of Man that Christopher is very effusive in his thanks to Henry Hope Reed, the kind of acknowledgement that says, but for Henry Hope Reed, I wouldn't and couldn't have written this book. And the truth of the matter is that Henry, who was not nearly the star that Christopher Tunnard was at that time, was truthfully the co-author of the book and deserves to be noted as such. This is a fabulous book. It is still well worth reading, published originally in 1953, and it is a book about, as the subtitle of the book says, architecture, city planning, civic art, written at a time before, there were 250 books on architecture, city planning, and civic art published every season by academic presses. This was not a big publishing field, either in academic or popular publishing in 1953. And so a book like this, which surveyed American cities, which surveyed American architecture, which talked about how our cities grew and became what they were and came to look the way they look, which is what this book is about. This was a relatively rare thing, and Henry was sort of present at the creation of this great wave of interest in the subject of American architecture and urbanism. This is Christopher Tunnard, by the way. I said that he was a star, that he was a giant, and indeed, Christopher Tunnard was. Christopher Tunnard was one of the most famous landscape architects in the world when Henry came to know him. But he was a modernist landscape architect. Indeed, some regarded him as the most important figure in the development of a modernist landscape architecture in England, which is where, well, Christopher Tunnard was originally from Canada, but he went to live in England, and that's where he grew to such fame. He and his partner, the architect Raymond McGrath, designed this house and garden in Surrey. And as you can see, this isn't really Henry Hope Reed sort of stuff, is it? They were strongly influenced by Le Corbusier, and this was Tunnard's reputation. Tunnard went then to Yale, where he was a professor of urban planning. And this was actually very common at the time. Urban planning was a field that was once dominated by people with landscape architecture backgrounds. That is far from the case in 2021, but it was landscape architects, people like Frederick Law Olmsted's son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And Henry always used to love to say that Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was a more talented designer than his father, who really pioneered the academic discipline of urban planning. And so there wasn't anything particularly unusual about the fact that a landscape architect would come to be a professor of urban planning at Yale. But because of his friendship with Henry, Tunnard brought Henry on board at Yale, and together the two men kind of altered their views of things. Tunnard never really became the staunch advocate of a contemporary classicism that Henry did, but Tunnard did pretty much put his modernist landscape architect days to the side to focus on, among other things, historic preservation, because Tunnard had come to realize that the traditional form of cities in Britain and in America was something that the modernists really had no answer to, no alternative for. And this is a garden that Tunnard designed later after he'd come to America in Newport. You know, the modernists, such as Tunnard, had always been interested in the Japanese landscape gardening tradition, but after Tunnard had visited Japan, he realized that Japanese gardens were actually a much more diverse set of things than he and his fellow modernists had always presumed them to be. And he began to incorporate elements of Japanese style into his gardens in a way that he and others had not done before, and his gardens began to take on a little bit more of a homier feel than what you see in this picture. But in any event, Christopher and Henry then wrote another book, again, a marvelous book that is still well worth reading. This is in 1956. The book is called American Skyline, subtitled The Growth and Form of Our Cities and Towns. It covers a lot of the same territory as The City of Man, but it really is a kind of chronological history of American architecture and urbanism. It has virtues that many subsequent such books don't have, namely a deeply sort of cultured understanding of art and architecture, a prose which is sort of far more richly elusive than what we would expect to find in a typical academic tome on this subject. And as I say, it is a book that is still very well worth reading, and a book that is really pointing in the direction of Henry's future work, particularly The Golden City, a book that we are indeed sort of celebrating tonight. The Golden City was published by Doubleday in 1959, and by this time, Henry had become firmly convinced not only that America had a great classical heritage in its arts and architecture and cities, but that there wasn't any real reason why we shouldn't continue this. And he was saying this amid the modernist onslaught of the post-war years. The Golden City came out just as the Seagram building was rising on Park Avenue. The Golden City is a remarkable book, and I'm sure that many of you have read the book. Henry sort of states his case. He does so in a very, very strongly worded way. And this is the Henry that we all know and love. Henry, wasn't the sort to say, yes, but. Henry was the sort to say, no, you're wrong. And this book is very much in that manner. By the way, I do quote something that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, then Jacqueline Kennedy, said about the book. She said, reading this book was like finding a long-lost friend or mentor. And indeed, she was a very great admirer of Henry. To her dying day. The Golden City was published by a major house, Doubleday. It was dutifully reviewed in, for example, the New York Times Book Review, where the San Francisco-based architecture critic Alan Temko wrote about the book and basically said the kinds of things that people would be saying about Henry, are still saying about Henry. If ever a man would seem to have been born after his time, the architectural historian, one is tempted to say antiquarian, Henry Hope Reed Jr., and he was known back then as Henry Hope Reed Jr., is he. For Mr. Reed, a confirmed neoclassicist, abhors modern architecture, all modern architecture, not just the austere geometric creations of Mies van der Rohe and his followers, but the entire range of the movement, including the robust romanticism of Frank Lloyd Wright, and on and on. And indeed, I think this is the best headline ever to appear in the New York Times Book Review: wanted more colonnades and gadroons. Temko sort of goes on in this vein in the review, but then, he doesn't really do an about face, but he does say that, when we look at our cities, when we look at what we've made of our cities in the post-war era under the modernist banner, maybe there's something to be said for Henry's approach. Not that Temko would ever be a convert to that approach, but he senses that Henry is maybe on to something. Henry's model for this book was a very famous book in the history of architecture, a book called Contrasts, with one of those early 19th century very long subtitles, that was written by the great figure of the Gothic revival in Britain. Now, Henry in the Golden City actually takes some pretty big swipes at Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. So it's not that he was arguing along Pugin's lines, but Pugin did this book called Contrasts. And what Pugin did was on facing pages of the book, in order to show the obvious superiority of Gothic over classical, he would show a certain building type, in this case, a chapel, on the left, designed in a classical style, and then the same building type designed in a Gothic style. And Pugin was such the Gothicist that he was absolutely certain that when anybody looked at these two side by side, they would see immediately that the Gothic was vastly superior. Not that any of us do, but that was how he felt. And Henry adopted this approach in The Golden City. There is that whole section in The Golden City where Henry juxtaposes these images of a certain building type in a classical style with one in a modernist style. And he felt that in so doing, people would be jolted into the realization that the classical, the older way of doing things was much superior. Not that this worked on everybody, but it was very effective in Henry's hands. Here, for example, we see two art museums. On the left, we see the central section of the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Richard Morris Hunt, and on the right, we see Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum. Or here, he shows the older wing of the Yale University Art Gallery by Egerton Swartwit, and on the right, he shows the newer wing of the Yale Art Gallery by Louis Kahn. Here, this is my very favorite. Henry was a great fan of flagpole bases. And by the way, not until one met Henry did one ever realize there was such a thing as a great fan of flagpole bases. But once you met Henry, you yourself became a great fan of flagpole bases. And on the left was one of Henry's very favorite things in the whole world, which were the bronze flagpole bases on the terrace of the New York Public Library, which are so magnificently modeled. And he juxtaposes that with the flagpole that is in the plaza of Mies van der Rohe, a Seagram building on Park Avenue. And if any two-page spread in The Golden City makes Henry's point triumphantly, I think that this is it. Here he juxtaposes two modern arches, the great Soldiers and Sailors Arch in Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, from which I am speaking at the moment. This Henry called one of America's great works of art. And on the right is, of course, Eero Saarinen's Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And notice Henry's succinct description of it, the two words, no comment. The Golden City was just in 2020 reprinted by the Monacelli Press in a beautiful new edition, which features new essays by Alvin, Holm, and Catesby, Leigh, as has been said. Henry also wrote a column for the New York Herald Tribune. The Herald Tribune sadly doesn't exist anymore, but it was once a paper that was on a par with the New York Times. It was a very large circulation daily, and of all America's newspapers, it had the reputation for being a real writer's newspaper. The writers for the Herald Tribune often had great personality. And Henry was given the opportunity to write a column about architecture for the New York Herald Tribune. He did this for a couple of years. It was a kind of a precursor, if you will. If any of you recall the late Christopher Gray's Streetscapes column in the New York Times, it was a little bit along those lines, but Henry wrote about New York architecture in these columns in a way that really no one ever had before. He opened people's eyes to the architecture that was around. And I'm going to get back to that point in a moment. Henry also became very deeply involved in the historic preservation movement in New York. And his colleagues in that endeavor, who were also his friends, included very notable people. The great American architectural historian and the librarian of the Avery Library at Columbia, Talbot Hamlin, whom you see on the left, and on the right, on the top, is Alan Burnham, an architect with a firm that Henry admired called Shanley and Sturgis, and on the bottom, Albert Bard, the great lawyer who laid the legal groundwork for a landmarks law in New York City, a law that did not take effect until 1965. But all through the 1950s and the early 1960s, there was a very aggressive movement for legislation or special zoning that would protect endangered old buildings in New York, something that nowadays we take for granted because it's 2021. And you know what? There are 36,000 protected buildings in the 5 boroughs of New York City. When Henry was at work on this with these gentlemen, there were 0 protected buildings in New York City. Henry wasn't necessarily the single most important figure in this movement, but he was nonetheless a critically important figure in this movement. And again, I'll have something to say about that in just a couple of minutes. Henry's other great interest was, he was always interested in landscape architecture, perhaps partly the influence of Christopher Tunnard, I don't know, but Henry was not only somebody who, like so many New Yorkers, loved Central Park, but arguably, he was more knowledgeable about Central Park and its history and the underlying ideas of its landscape architecture than was anyone else in the New York of his time. Today, of course, there are several noted experts on Central Park, but when Henry was at it, there weren't. Indeed, there had been so many changes made to Central Park since it was first designed by Olmsted and Vaux that the recovery of the original Olmsted and Vaux vision for Central Park was something that Henry kind of made his own field in such a way that he would influence those who came later. Henry's knowledge of Central Park, his concern for Central Park were such that not only did he write a marvelous, and I'll say it again, still well worth reading history of Central Park, but he was actually given a New York City position that had never existed before and that doesn't exist anymore, but with a marvelous title. Henry was named Curator of Central Park. Henry used to joke that he had to get his telephone number unlisted because he would get calls from people at home in the evening asking him things like, how do I get a license to play softball in the park? And this, of course, wasn't at all Henry's job. Um, his job was to study Central Park, to educate the public about Central Park, to organize walking tours of Central Park, and to advocate for Central Park's landscapes. And he did so vigorously that the people, the Lindsay administration, which appointed him to this position, actually began to regret their decision because he was a thorn in their side. So, for example, this is actually before he was appointed to that position, historian irked by Central Park. Again, one of the great newspaper headlines says rural atmosphere is dispelled by innovations. But the thing that really set people off is when the Parks Commissioner, Thomas Hoving, who would later be the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a very well-known man, allowed this gigantic Barbra Streisand concert to take place in the park. And Henry immediately took to the newspapers to denounce this and to say that it caused great damage to the park and that this wasn't what the park was for. And Hoving then went to the newspapers and called Henry Hope Reed a fuddy-duddy. And much to the credit of the New York Times, they ran an editorial that took Henry's side and said, if Henry is, as Thomas Hoving says he is, a fuddy-duddy, then maybe what the world needs right now is more fuddy-duddies. And there is Henry in later years in Central Park, right by the conservatory water on the east side of the park. If you can see my red dot that in PowerPoint lingo is called a laser pointer, this building, 927 Fifth Avenue by Warren and Wetmore, was a particular favorite building of Henry's. But the thing that I think one of the things that Henry is most important for and best known for is that in his role as an advocate for historic preservation in New York City, he thought, this came out of meetings of the venerable New York City civic organization called the Municipal Art Society of New York that had been founded in 1893. Its founding president was Richard Morris Hunt. But this organization was the leading organization in advocating for historic preservation legislation in New York, and Henry was one of the people who worked with the Municipal Art Society in this endeavor. And one day at a meeting, they were, sitting around talking about how can we engage the public? How can we get greater public interest in this subject and public support for this subject? And Henry had an idea. When Henry had been, as a young man, in Rome, he owned a copy of a very famous Victorian guidebook to Rome called Walks in Rome by Augustus Hare. Augustus Hare is the sort of writer, once very famous, who is now not famous at all. And I reckon that most people present tonight are not readers of Augustus Hare, which is too bad, because Augustus Hare's guidebooks are really fabulous. Henry himself navigated the streets of Rome with Augustus Hare's Walks in Rome, with their detailed itineraries and their wealth of information about Roman buildings. Rome, of course, is one of those cities that you can navigate with a 100-year-old guidebook. Most cities you can't do that in, but in Rome you can. Henry did, and this gave Henry the idea of leading guided walking tours of New York City history and architecture as a way to help build the constituency for historic preservation legislation in the city. And you might think, wait a minute, did Henry invent the New York walking tour? Well, he invented the serious New York walking tour. Today, walking tours are, of course, they're an accepted part of the city's culture. And on any given weekend in years when there isn't a raging global pandemic, you can find you have your choice of like 100 walking tours that you can go on in New York City, of course wildly varying quality. But back in 1956, when Henry took to the streets for the first time, there were approximately, on any given weekend, how shall I put it, 0 walking tours of the city to choose from. Indeed, the walking tour was such an unusual and novel thing in New York City that when Henry led his first tour under the auspices of the Municipal Art Society, the New York Times thought it worthy of coverage. They sent a reporter on the tour. It turns out that the day of that very first tour, April 8th, 1956, was a horrible day. It was rainy and snowy and slushy and cold, and yet many people nonetheless showed up for this tour. They stayed till the end, and in sometimes driving rain, Henry stood on the street and told people about the buildings around them. And the tour took in the area of Madison Square and Gramercy Park. Madison Square back then wasn't the Madison Square of today. Today, it's one of the most popular areas of Manhattan, but back then it was a backwater that was seldom visited by anybody who didn't happen to work in Madison Square. And of course, very few people were aware that it was one of the architecturally richest parts of New York. Thus, when Henry led people around and he talked about the buildings and talked about their importance and waxed poetic about their ornament, this stuff that people were hearing was brand new to them. And that's the real point that I wish to make tonight, that so much of what Henry was talking about in the 50s and 60s was brand new to people. They had never thought about the buildings around them in the way that Henry was getting them to think about the buildings around them. This was nothing short of a revolution. The New Yorker also covered Henry's walking tours. Indeed, the New Yorker writer who wrote about them in the New Yorker's famous Talk of the Town section was Brendan Gill, very famous figure in New York, and he wrote about Henry and his walking tours in October 1956 in a piece entitled Griffins for Delight. And one of the things that Brendan Gill said about the walking tour with Henry Hope Reed, this one was in Lower Manhattan, he said, and this is so perfectly put, we saw, as if for the first time, buildings we have looked at all our life. We hadn't reached the bottom step of the sub-treasury before it became evident that Mr. Reed considers nearly every building that has gone up here since about 1930, when traditional architecture began to give way to modern, a mere bathroom-like abomination worthy only of being pulled down. Mr. Reed is especially fond of the Wall Street district because it was there that the great exponents of the Beaux-Arts method of architectural training, since supplanted by the Bauhaus and other methods, reached their finest flower. And here is the kind of thing that Henry said that nobody had ever said before. Henry said, "Nothing like this superb complex of buildings can be seen anywhere on earth. Only the Acropolis and the Campidoglio in Rome deserve to be compared to it." And when New Yorkers heard that, or when they read Henry say things like, New York is one of the great classical cities of the world, like Rome, Leningrad, Paris, Washington, Vienna, and Dublin, it is a proud daughter of that Greco-Roman Mediterranean to which we owe so much. this just changed the way everybody looked at and thought about their surroundings in New York City and in other American cities. It was profound. And there are many of us, myself included, who wouldn't be here, who wouldn't be doing what we do in life, but for Henry having said those things when he said them. This is an amusing thing. Women are ardent fans of city walking tours, but the reason that I include this is because the writer in the New York Times refers to Henry as a modern Pied Piper. And that almost became Henry's nickname, the Pied Piper, because he was leading these groups, often immensely large groups, like 100 people round New York City. And here we see Henry in really what I think of as his somewhat raffish phase. It was very unusual not to see Henry in a jacket and tie. The open neck, that sort of rakishly tilted cap. There he is in front of the Soldiers and Sailors Arch in Brooklyn. No doubt at the moment this photograph was taken, he was telling people, this is one of the great works of art in America. And people who went on Henry's tours were often inspired. For instance, Margot Gale is a name well known in New York because she led the movement to save from destruction the great collection of cast iron fronted buildings in Soho. But she said very openly that she knew nothing about the cast iron buildings of Soho until she was introduced to them on a walking tour by Henry Hope Reed. So she gets the credit for saving those buildings, but she never would have known about them if it hadn't been for Henry Hope Reed. Here is Henry with some of his fellow preservationists. The man who is in the lower left is James Grote Vanderpool, who is a great American architectural historian, who in fact had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts under Georges Grosmont, and was one of the founders of the Society of Architectural Historians. The woman in the middle on the bottom is Ruth Wittenberg, who was the sister-in-law of Louis Mumford. Here's Henry shaking hands with Clay Lancaster, a like-minded figure and also a very important figure. Like Henry, they were friends. Here they are at Clay's book party at the Great Gage and Tollner restaurant in New York. Henry became very good friends with an architect who also had Philadelphia connections because he's descended from the family of the great Philadelphia architects, the brothers Hewitt. And that is John Barrington Bayley. Bayley was a very serious classicist. Indeed, in 1959, Bayley had an idea for what New York City could do with its great problem child known as Columbus Circle. This is what John Barrington Bayley suggested for Columbus Circle. This is what John Barrington Bayley suggested New York City public housing should look like. And of course, John Barrington Bayley and Henry Hope Reed knew full well that these sorts of things would never be built, but some years later, when the Frick Collection needed to build an addition, they actually consulted with Henry. And Henry put them on to John Barrington Bayley, and Bayley designed the splendid new reception hall of the Frick Collection in a fully classical style, and this was in 1977. It was a triumphant moment for Henry, and alas, it's being, as we speak, gutted in the Frick Collection's current expansion. Henry and John Barrington Bayley were two of the founders of the very important organization called Classical America, which sought to promote an understanding of the classical tradition in the arts and architecture in America, and also to advocate for a new classicism in America. And their partners in arms in that endeavor included the remarkable musicologist James T. Marr, arguably the single greatest authority on American jazz and popular song in his time, and the author of a book that Henry thought very highly of called The Twilight of Splendor, Chronicles of the Age of American Palaces, in which James T. Marr wrote about the great White Marsh Hall in Windmore, Pennsylvania. David Garrard Lowe, who is a name very well known to some of you, I am sure, and who is with us still, was also among those founding members of classical America. And then a bit later, Henry became very, very close to the painter Pierce Rice. Henry was influenced strongly by Pierce Rice's views about the history of art and about the centrality of the human figure in the history of art. Pierce Rice, by the way, made his living in part as a comic book artist. This is, in fact, a comic book drawing by Pierce Rice. The thing is, Henry often said that if you wish to see the classical in today's world, you must look for it in unexpected places. Sometimes you will find it in comic books. Sometimes you will find it in advertising art. Pierce Rice, in his book, talks about cherubs and their importance as one of the defining forms of decoration in the Western tradition. Henry, of course, loved his cherubs, the great cherub staircase in the Library of Congress, or the carved wooden cherubs in the ceiling of the Gottesman Hall of the New York Public Library. And Henry, of course, wrote the definitive book about the architecture and decoration of the New York Public Library. The great Philadelphia historian, I have one more slide, John Lucas, was another person who deeply admired Henry. And here, celebrating Henry's Philadelphia roots, shortly after Henry's death, was a symposium held at the Franklin Inn Club. And you can see that's me speaking, but that to my right is Al Holm. And finally, this is Henry with his great patron Arthur Ross and Arthur Ross's wife Janet Ross at an Arthur Ross Awards dinner at the University Club in Manhattan. And so this was my little journey through the life and works of Henry Hope Reed. I hope that you learned something about Henry that you didn't know before, and I thank you all very much for listening to me.
Francis, thank you so much for your fabulous presentation. I'm Barbara Hogue. I'm the chapter coordinator for the ICA in Philadelphia. Francis, would you take a few questions if folks were interested?
There are some questions in the Q&A. Somebody asked if I will show the picture with me in it again. That was a wonderful afternoon, by the way, at the Franklin Inn. Many people who knew Henry came to speak about him. It was a great afternoon, but it would also be great to do this at a venue like the New York Public Library or the United States Capitol, which Henry wrote, as I said, the definitive book about. And somebody asks if, in order to see the McKim, Mead and White and George B. Post files, are they publicly available or just by appointment? They're just by appointment. They're special collection materials, the white gloves and all of that business. But if you do apply for an appointment, you'll get one and you'll be able to look at them. Did he visit White Marsh Hall and what did he think of it? He thought White Marsh Hall was one of the great things that had ever been built in America. As I said, he revered Horace Trumbauer. thought Trumbauer to be as great an architect as America ever produced. And Henry believed that there was much in the study of these great houses that very often some of the finest craftsmanship and decoration was to be found in these houses. I mentioned Vizcaya, but Whitemarsh Hall, its destruction was something that Henry thought was simply unconscionable. And if there are any, happy to take them. And if there are not, then I shall once again thank you all very much for your interest in Henry Hope Reed, and hope to see you again.
There was just one more question, which was, will this be available? And yes, it will be available. So thank you so much, Francis, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.